Outside of game start distance, controlling the space between Sub Zero and Skarlet can be extremely volatile for either party. Thinking of a game plan in neutral after game start distance can be daunting for newer players, so let's cover everything this might entail, as I possibly can. First, I'd like to talk about what I mean by ideal distance. Ideal distance, according to me, is when you and your opponent are in a neutral state and you have more advantages than your opponent does at a particular distance from said opponent. For Skarlet, I can make a couple of arguments about where her ideal distance may be, but wherever it may be, it is not maximum distance. At maximum distance, Skarlet's only options are her projectiles, because everything else whiffs. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can get a little closer and achieve the same circumstance. The only thing you achieve by getting even further away is putting you closer to the corner, which is not very cool for Skarlet. Minimizing this distance from the corner and still achieving this goal is important if you're not using Heart Pierce variation, the one with the teleport, the very slow and possibly very expensive one. There are a couple of distances Skarlet might want to be in during this matchup. It's mostly due to Slide being really scary. I'd like to make an argument for her ideal distance in reactable and unreactable distances and how to check for yourself. If you're making the read that Sub-Zero likely won't slide in neutral at that given moment, Skarlet can go into close ideal distance where she can start applying pressure with her longer strings and with Punish easier. Just know that once your turn is over, be on the lookout for a slide reversal attack. Now, technically, there exists a distance where Sub-Zero strings, including forward 2, will whiff and Skarlet's B4 sweep will hit. It exists, but it's frame perfect and therefore not really practical. Just pray you're in the blessed frames, otherwise count on looking out for Sub-Zero's B1, F2, and F4, and slide, of course. A good whiff punish distance for Skarlet is here. It's Skarlet's far blood port distance. We're going to use the health bar as the measure of distance. On each health bar, there exists 6 spaced out black vertical lines. Once we get into 30% health, we get a lot more black lines closer together. We want to be between the first and second black lines from 30%. Please use the uppermost portion of Skarlet's head to line up here. In terms of defense, this is a strong position to stay in. You can default to crouch blocking if you read this slide, and I mean read. In neutral, everything is reliant on guessing or reading, and you'd rather read your opponent if you can than guess. Beyond slide, Sub-Zero doesn't have a lot of options. All his strings, including his overhead whiff, and his ice ball is reactable at any distance. He is reduced to walking forward for a fence, or forward 4, which is reactable with standing 1 or down 1. Now, frame data is still important in neutral, but for different reasons. Attacks have startup frames, sure, but they also have range. If Sub-Zero walks forward to make his 19 frame overhead hit, it's not 19 frames of startup anymore, but instead 19 frames plus however long he is walking before the startup frames, known now as 19 plus frames. But here is Skarlet at this distance, staying perfectly still and letting Sub-Zero eat up the walking frames for you in neutral. Throw out your 13 frame or so pokes to stuff Sub-Zero's now 19 plus frame overhead, for example. Even if Sub-Zero doesn't walk forward, nearly all of his attacks have enough forward movement to let you whiff punish him anyway. Cloud his judgment of distance by walking back and forth rapidly in neutral if you read that he won't slide. Otherwise, keep crouch blocking if you're unsure. That's my argument for Skarlet's ideal distance within slide range, so let's talk about where she wants to go if this particular Sub-Zero gets a little too slide happy. From game start distance, take 2 back jumps. For health bar reference, this position is on the 4th black line from 30%. Sub-Zero's slide was here. In terms of neutral priority, Skarlet wants to move into close ideal distance and go into far ideal distance if she gets like knocked down or thrown there or something, or you just can't handle Sub-Zero's offense. Maintaining far ideal distance is more difficult for Skarlet to do, especially if she's not Heart Pierce Variation and lacks the far teleport or lacks both defense bars. If you're trying to get here from a far blood port, take 1 jump back and keep walking until you line up with the 4th black line. If Skarlet remains in neutral, she can react to Sub-Zero's Ice Ball with Blood Trail. Make your input before the Ice Ball comes out, or else you're making the worst projectile trade in the game. Otherwise, she doesn't have to worry about anything else Sub-Zero throws out, even his Thin Ice Variation projectiles. Dead of Winter Amplified Ice Balls, however, are anti-projectile in nature and aren't very reactable. Just duck and use Blood Trail if his meter runs out. Even at this distance, however, all of Skarlet's other projectiles are not safe on block during a trade with Ice Ball. Her projectiles just have too much startup. Therefore, either Blood Trail Sub-Zero's first Ice Ball on reaction, which lets you block the second if he does so, or throw out Blood Shot or Blood Ball on his cooldown. Once Sub-Zero starts blocking or getting hit, you have enough frame advantage to suppress his Ice Ball. Remember, Blood Tentacle is minus at any distance, so don't use this if you don't want to risk giving up your turn. Only use Tentacle to punish. If Skarlet is at far ideal distance, Sub-Zero's goal then, in neutral, is to close the distance into slide range or attempt to trade with Ice Ball. At close ideal distance, his goal in neutral is to move into range for his block strings or slide. Swapping between close and far ideal distance can have their advantages when maintaining the previous distance becomes infeasible. Here are a couple of situations that I think doing that is a good idea. One situation at far ideal distance is if Skarlet backing up to maintain this distance would bring her way too close for comfort to the corner. Swap to close ideal distance and start applying pressure. For close ideal distance, Sub-Zero starts backing up and you don't feel comfortable walking forward to maintain it. If you're not feeling so brave in slide range, you can back up while Sub-Zero does the same and very quickly end up in far ideal distance to start throwing your projectiles. Those are my arguments for Skarlet's possible ideal distances against Sub-Zero. If you come from a background of games that would demand you constantly look all over the screen like Guilty Gear, then coordinating your position along the health bar should be fairly easy. But for most people playing Mortal Kombat 11, not having this trained skill would be understandable without lots of practice. For those players, knowing the range of Sub-Zero's slide at the very least would be my highest recommendation. Labbing that out should be enough to make this video helpful. In the future, I hope to cover close distance and round start distance soon. Let me know in the comments if you have any more questions about these distances. This is Mormel, and this was covering ideal distances for Skarlet against Sub-Zero.
Skarlet